On a vacation, sorry. So on a vacation, souvenirs are what we bring home both to remember our trips and kind of as a way to prove that we were there. So what souvenirs are your students taking away from your course that they can use to remind themselves of their prior learning and that provides proof of what they have learned? Before I go any further, I do want to apologize for the last minute reschedule. A family health thing came up and all I can do is apologize for that. So I do want to mention the companion course again. This course is available to all of you. It is the online course development training course, which should show up under your no terms listing. And that has a lot of extra information and goes into some more depth on what we're covering. But in addition to that, what we have is now the course development training shells are up. So also in no term, you should now see something called course development training with your last name. So that is a course for you to play with and do with as you need. I had a small technical hiccup, but shortly they during this breakout have given you guys practice shells. So if you ever feel like you've just got too many development shells sitting around, just drop a line to help@oswego.edu and we can help clean up things a bit. Again, the development training shell is a prototype shell, so the material on there will be added to over time, or at least that is our intent. So quick review from yesterday. The model that we use as instructional designers is a backwards design model. And yesterday we really focused our conversation on creating learning outcomes. Today, we'll look at crafting assessments that allow students to work toward and eventually show their mastery of these learning outcomes. And with doing that, we'll also cover some general concepts around creating quality assessments and even some examples of assessments that you may want to use. So it's going to get kind of dense and I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time, but worst comes to worst, you may see my attempts at talking really fast. So if we look at our outcomes for these workshops today, we're really going to be focusing on creating meaningful and relevant course assessments. So the first thing I want to start with is the idea of an artifact. Now, well, this is a really cool artifact on the screen. In fact, it's one of the oldest artifacts known to have been found. It is the Lion Man from Stadell Cave, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the rest because I will slaughter it, but it is 30 to 40,000 years old. Unfortunately, outside a very specific type of field, this is not the type of artifact that we are talking about. In the context of backwards design, an artifact is really an intermediate step between your learning objectives and your assessments. And what it can help you do is, instead of thinking about how you would assess a learning objective directly, think about what evidence or artifact a student would need to provide to show that they have mastered that learning objective. And with that in mind, it can be a little bit easier to move forward with creating an assessment that will provide or create that artifact for students. So now let's think about assessments in general. So from the University of Delaware, this slightly paraphrased, but after developing learning outcomes for your course, the next step is backwards design is to develop assessments. Assessments provide the artifacts, just like we just talked about, for student learning. For most people, the natural place to start with is a course's major assignments like exams, large projects, term papers, etc. And once those are developed, they can be checked to ensure that they are aligned with and address all of the course learning objectives. Then you can further analyze these to determine what specific skills and knowledge students need to be successful in those assignments. And so now you're no longer looking at the course level, you're looking at the assignment level, and you can use that analysis to build out course objectives for the actual modules of the course. And then the idea is that you would use secondary lower stakes assessments to scaffold for those high stakes assessments. And I don't think that's a bad definition of assessments, but I think that we get caught in the idea as instructors that assessments are really about helping us measure student learning, because at the end of the day, we know we have to give a grade to or assign a grade based on what a student has learned. But I'd like you to take a step back and think about assessments as a way to allow students to discover where they are excelling and how they can improve. And I think the latter is missed sometimes. So just ask, how do students feel about feedback, and what does feedback provide them with? So with that kind of in the back of our mind, I want to talk about the idea of meaningful assessments, which is a term that I hear thrown around a lot. So what I'm going to be talking about here comes pretty much straight from the University of California at Santa Barbara. The link to where all this material came from is in the companion course, and I'd encourage you to dive into it. They have a lot of really neat stuff. But what we ask first is, what does meaningful mean when we're talking about assessments? And meaningful assessments make the course content relevant to students because they have the following 5 characteristics, or at least some of these characteristics. Oops. So first we start with compelling purpose. This one's pretty obvious in that you want there to be clear connections between the assessment and the types of thinking, skills, and knowledge that are described in the course learning outcomes. So literally, you want it to be obvious, almost painfully obvious to your students, that this is how this assessment ties to the learning outcomes. And if students have trouble grasping that, just spell it out. It's perfectly fine in a module overview, or even in an assignment, to say, here are the learning objectives that this assessment is helping you achieve. Next, we have that it helps people learn from their missteps. And this goes back a little bit towards what I was talking about, in that, what does feedback mean for students? So this is really just the idea of building in flexibility and feedback that can reduce student stress and improve learning. And I really want to call out that idea of stress. We know that our students are under a lot of stress for a lot of reasons, but certain types of assessment practices can certainly drive that stress up. And furthermore, we know that stress affects the academic performance of our students. And there are definitely strategies that we can use in assessment to sort of scaffold our students into harder assignments and lower their overall stress. Next is structured for access and equity. And I'm going to dive a little further into this, because I think when we think of access, we think of, extra time, things that screen readers will work with, but it really goes far beyond that. And my colleague, Carrie Mocyk, could talk about this much more in depth and probably much more accurately than I can, but I will do my best. So what you're looking to do is increase access and equitable outcomes among diverse learners by incorporating the following practices. The first is communicating your expectations and grading criteria in the assignment instructions, or by using a rubric, or potentially by sharing high quality work. It's well demonstrated that the better students understand what constitutes good work, the higher quality their work will likely be. Second, use grading criteria that focuses on the specific skills being learned and less on peripheral skills such as writing and knowledge of complex vocabulary like idioms and jargon that are not directly related to the class. Now, obviously, if the class is biology, there's certain terms like mitochondria that the students are going to need to know. But when you're looking at their writing as a whole, ask yourself, are they getting the core concepts more than are they doing a good job writing? And I'll probably get yelled at to some extent by the writing center for that. But this is a real issue, especially for people with English as a second language. So again, reflect on what is the most important learning outcomes from your course and focus on those, and have this idea of general quality of peripheral skills being a secondary thing. And then give students multiple and varied opportunities to demonstrate their learning rather than relying predominantly on traditional high stakes exams. We'll dive into this a little bit more later, but basically it's just the idea at the most basic level. Some people are good test takers, some people write good papers, some people have ideas that you haven't even thought about that they would like to share. Authentic to students' interests, lives, and future careers. Again, this is kind of obvious, but it fosters intrinsic motivation by providing opportunities for students to take responsible for and use their own agency in learning. So last session, I talked a little bit about engagement based on who you are as the instructor and making things authentic to the job field that you're looking at. And this is a little different because this is saying, I want to give opportunities for students to use their own life experiences and to take on some agency in this class. And a very easy way to do this, relatively speaking, since a lot of things are easier said than done, is to give students options on topics and types of assignments. Finally, the assignments should ideally reflect the way people in your discipline think and work. And this is really your chance as the instructor to take the idea of being a creative expert by the horns, because you are the one that knows what real learning and work look like in your discipline. And for me, the most basic version of this is simply asking yourself the question, how do people with careers in your industry share their ideas beyond academic papers? In your career, do people do videos? Do they do blogs? Do they create websites? Do they write op-eds? Do they participate in social media campaigns? So there's a lot of different ways to think about how do I communicate in my field, and you as the subject matter expert know the answer to that question better than anybody. So I'm not going to spend much time on this next slide. Again, this is available on the companion course, but these are just some very quick questions that are based on those points that we just went through that allow you to do a really quick assessment, a really quick check on any assessment that you have assigned. And an easy way to say, hey, the answer to that's no. Can I make the answer to that particular question? Yes. Damn it. Sorry, this is always the wonders of trying to have notes on one computer and actually running things on another computer. So what I want to look at next is the idea of what is it reasonable to expect from your students in classes. As an instructional designer, when I work with faculty, this is actually a question I get a lot. Basically, well, how much can I assign my students? And this often comes from faculty hearing a complaint that, well, I don't have this much work in my other courses. So first of all, that is pretty much something you can ignore. It is your course, you know what needs to be covered, and you know what needs to be done to cover those points. So what other faculty members are doing is not really your concern. If you get too worried about it, I would suggest sitting down in your department setting and talking about what is an appropriate workload if there is disagreement on that. But generally, it's just not something I would worry about. You do what you think you have to for the course. However, with that, I can give a few guidelines. The first thing is just what is a credit in an online course? Well, this comes straight from SUNY guidelines. It aligns roughly with the idea of contact hours, except contact hours are not a thing in online courses. So what your role as the instructor is simply to think about how long are the activities going to take. So you're not worried about contact hours, you are worried about how much time is the student going to spend on their work overall. And I can even give you a neat little tool to do that with. And again, this is available on the companion website. But this is a course workload estimator. And there's actually a newer version of that that just came out. And that is the link that is in the companion course. But basically what it lets me do is put in information on the course, put in information on what I'm thinking about for assignments, and it will give me a total workload estimate. And using that, sorry, I have to try to get back to my other screen. Okay, this was not supposed to be this challenging. So using that workload calculator, you can bounce back to, well, how much work should students be doing per credit? Now, the other thing that we can look at is, of course, we all know we have our 100 level, our 200 level, our 300 level courses, et cetera. And it's not always clear what you should be teaching to what detail in that. Now, your primary source for that is always going to be your own experience and the official course outline, if there is one. But you can also talk with other members of your department. I think departments working together to answer questions about what should be the standards in a course is a great thing to do. But if you just want some place to start, this is an example from Lake Superior State University that covers basically what you might think about doing in different levels of courses, and then what those actual activities look for. So again, it's just a resource you can use to start as you're thinking about what do I actually want to do in a 300 level course, for example. So now we're going to skip to a little bit of an outlier, but as we just finished talking about what's involved with creating a quality, meaningful assignment, I wanted to bring up these tools because they can really help improve the quality of assignments by making sure that students understand the expectations. Rubrics, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I think a lot of people think about these more as a feedback tool. oh, I can fill out a rubric that gives more detailed feedback to my students, but also saves me a lot of time. And that's all very true. But I would argue that in most cases, you want to provide the rubric ahead of time so that it's very clear to students what the expectations are and what they need to do in order to get the grade that they want, whether that's an A, a B. Hopefully they want an A or a B. And Brightspace has a very robust rubric tool, and there are some links on how to use it and also on some creative use cases for it. But this is one that I'd really encourage you to follow up with an instructional designer on. Again, help at oswego.edu to talk about exactly what you want to do with your rubrics, and we will do our absolute best to make it happen. Another similar idea is the idea of a sample assignment. Now, I've seen these used as a grading tool after the fact, and I think that that is a very valid way of using it, and we'll touch on that more when we get into grading. But let's think about providing a sample case from the beginning. Now, depending on what the subject matter is for the question, I think it is fine to provide an entire paper or multiple papers as an exemplar. So this is what a really good paper looks like. But I think that works best when you're looking at different subjects. So here's a really good paper on the use of molecular biology to generate new anti-cancer drugs. Well, my paper is going to be on the work done on saving elephants through genetic manipulation. But so you don't really have to worry about them copying the exemplar paper, but it shows them what a good format looks like. The alternative is that you don't have to give them the whole paper. You could simply give them a starting point. So here's the introduction to your paper, just to get you started. Hey, here's maybe 7 or 8 that you can choose from. Pick one and write your paper based off of that. You could even have a little bit more fun and go the other way and give them the conclusion of the paper, and they have to write their paper in order to match that conclusion. But in both cases, you're giving them exemplar work to get them started. So we're just going to return to artifacts for a moment. If you recall, I gave you this worksheet on the first day. So again, it was a link in the companion course that would create your own copy. And now we're expanding this a little bit. So we still have our learning objectives, but what I'd like you to think about now is what artifacts might represent those learning objectives, and then what assessments would generate those artifacts. Again, this is optional, but I think it is a good activity. And if you want, there's also a discussion board where you can share your work on this with the rest of the people in the workshop. But anyways, this would actually represent an artifact for this workshop. Okay, I'm not doing too bad on times. So now I want to get a little bit more specifically into types of assessments. And I think the first assessment most people think about is the assignment. So generally, when we think of assignments in Brightspace, an assignment is something that you can upload an attachment to. So if we're thinking short assignments, that's usually something under 1,000 words. That's a very arbitrary number, but that's one that you hear thrown around a lot. So it's either a short paper or a short, what I would call office document uploaded. So maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's a PowerPoint. But the idea is it's something that is not taking students very long and is probably very focused on a small subject, or outcome. Next, we think of something that's a little bit more unique, which is the journal or periodic assignment. This is something where each entry would probably be a short assignment, but what you are looking for is for students to create something that they can look back on and understand how their learning has evolved, or you as the faculty member can look back through and you can make judgments on their ongoing learning and their development of critical thinking, what have you. There's a couple ways to do journals in Brightspace, but actually the easiest way I would argue is to use a discussion board. And I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of that right now, but I just want this to be clear because it can cause confusion for students if you're talking about assignments, which is an official term in Brightspace, but you're using a discussion board to collect what would normally be thought of as an assignment. So just be a little careful with your wording and presentation if you do decide to use this option. Then we come into long assignments, and these are the more traditional multi-week research papers, potentially an actual term paper, or even the end of a capstone project. And I don't think there's too much to be said about these because obviously the idea is to gather up all of the learning objectives and sort of capture the entirety of the course for this assignment. So the only thing that I'll say with that is that these are often multiple parts. So you may have the assignment, the PowerPoint that goes with the assignment or recorded presentation, and then you may even have data sets to go with that. That can all be loaded up into one assignment. The downside is if you want to do drafts, Brightspace doesn't really handle drafts that well. So what I would do is create ungraded stages for students to submit their work over time and get feedback prior to having the final assignment assessed. And the last thing I want to touch on is the idea of novel options. We very much tend to use the traditional paper or maybe a presentation as our assessment. But what if you just throw that out the door and you tell students, here's the topic, do whatever you want. And here's the kind of thing that you can get. And of course, I get an ad. So unfortunately, because of time, I don't have the option to play the whole thing. But again, it is available on the companion website. But if you didn't catch it, he is singing a cappella in 4-part done by himself about the Miocene era, which I don't really know much about, but that means I should sit through the song a few more times. Now, this is definitely a non-standard project, and this is a person that is not a biology major, but their faculty members said that they knew their stuff cold. And I would just ask you to think, if you had somebody that had to take one of your base level courses just as a requirement, are they going to be enthusiastic about that? Are they going to take anything out of that outside of maybe what they need to pass the test? And this idea of novel assignments really can engage students that otherwise would have no interest in what you're talking about. And Dr. Derek Ruff, who I had the, yes, pronounce his name right, who I had the opportunity to just see at a recent conference, to paraphrase him, noted, allowing multiple types of submissions can lead to higher student engagement and creativity. So, as with most things, the idiom that we like to use around here is, well, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. So I would not suggest that you suddenly open up every single assignment in your course and say, do whatever you want, surprise me. But consider if there is at least one sort of assignment where you can start playing with the idea of giving students more options for creativity, which in turn gives them more options for agency and increases their engagement in the material. So next, I just want to touch on my personal nemesis, quizzes and exams. If you've heard the term, some people are good at exams, some people are good at papers. I am not good at exams. But there are ways to address that, because sometimes a high stakes test is the best way to figure out whether or not your students are meeting your learning objectives. And so I think what we want to look at is, how do we support our students in getting to being comfortable taking a high stakes exam? So for what I want to touch on here is just 3 different ways of treating quizzes. The first is what I would call a knowledge check. So this is not graded in any way. Instead, it is simply a way for a student to know whether or not they know the material or they do not. There are a lot of ways of implementing this. Some of the ways do allow you as the faculty member to track how students are doing, which can be useful in looking for students that are specifically struggling, or just getting an idea of how the class in general is understanding, comprehending the material that you are teaching and working their way towards the learning outcomes. We've also just introduced a new system called Creator Plus, which is an add-on to Brightspace. And Kathy Dutton did a session on that earlier today, so it should be recorded. And that gives you some really fun options for doing these knowledge checks, although there is not a back end at the moment, so you can't do the tracking. Next is this idea of mastery quizzes. This is really knowledge checks where you're saying, okay, here's some incentive. So for one thing, knowledge checks are often embedded in the material. A mastery quiz would come after a section of material, so it's a little more comprehensive. But the basic idea is that I, as the student, can take a mastery quiz as many times as I need to. The questions are often drawn from a large pool, so each time it's different. And I do get a grade on it, but it's some nominal value of the final course, so maybe 5 or 10%. What you are doing here is really incentivizing the student to touch the material in a more thorough fashion, because oftentimes we read something, we believe just because we read it, we know it. This gives us a way to understand whether or not we actually got it without chewing up a massive amount of your time as the instructor. And it also begins making students more comfortable with the quizzing interface, which finally leads us to high stakes testing. And this is the traditional large test that counts for a large portion of your grade. There's a lot of ways to run this. Again, depending on what your goals with this is one where I would encourage you to talk to an instructional designer about exactly what you want to get out of the exam and what you want the student experience in that exam to be. Moving on to discussions, I have hit the point where I'm going to start talking a little bit faster. But I love discussions. because it gives me a chance to engage with the other members of a class. Or as an instructor, it just gives me a way to look at what the class is thinking about and discussing. So what's the general purpose of the discussion? Well, the most basic version is just adding a social component to the course. One of the biggest challenges we have with asynchronous courses is a feeling of isolation, both from students and from faculty members. So this just gives a very easy way of reminding students that there are other people there. It also gives a forum for critical analysis and thinking, because in a good discussion, not only am I researching and making my own point, but then I have to critically analyze other students' posts, and I potentially have to go back and defend my own post from some other person's critical analysis. The main thing is we do want to keep everything civil. So you do have to keep a little bit of an eye, but I've only seen less than one hand's worth of fingers of discussions really go off the rails in all the time I've been here. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But basically, I see discussions as a way of getting some of the benefits of a group without the same time commitment and complexity. So I would say, what makes a productive discussion? And a lot of that comes down to the question you ask. It's very tempting to ask an open-ended question like, did you have any questions on chapter 3? But I think a better way to do it in a lot of cases is to step back and start with the backwards design process again and say, what objective do I want my students to get? And then crafting a question that will hit on those points. One of my favorite examples is the Tarzan question. You can ask very briefly, why did Tarzan leave Jane? Oh, she didn't like him. Okay, well, what were the socioeconomic impacts and the role of women that led to Jane choosing to lead Tarzan? And now you've got a much narrower question where you can guide it right from the outset towards the outcomes and learning points that you want to make. Now, another question that we get often is, does every course need a discussion? Now, as an instructional designer, I would argue that every course can have a discussion, but that does not necessarily mean that they benefit from discussions. On the one hand, we have an accounting course where it is pure math. So there are no discussions in that whatsoever. On the other hand, we have a chemistry course where it is, again, very hard science, but the faculty member takes the time to ask questions about chemistry to link it to current events. And so I think, depending on what you're teaching, there is no need to force a discussion every week or whatever schedule seems appropriate. But I think that there is a benefit to trying to find a way to slip in at least 1 or 2 discussions to drive that social component and encourage them to do that critical thinking. Last thing I'll note is there are a lot of different assessment strategies for discussions. This, again, is a great conversation to have with an ID, because we can probably spend an hour just talking to you about all the different ways you could manage your discussion. I do just want to talk about group work really quickly, because for a long time, group work was really pushed hard because, of course, every student is going to have to eventually work in groups in the real world, or at least the vast majority of it. But what we're finding is that as the demographics of the university change and we get more non-traditional students, that non-traditional students and traditional students don't make good group pairs. They have different schedules, different priorities, and even different work ethics. So we used to be a big fan of randomizing groups because it was a very easy thing to just hit the button, you get some random groups, you're good to go. Now I think that it makes more sense to take a survey and try to customize the groups so that people that are at the same point in their lives can work on the same group. And I think you'll find that you have better group dynamics from that. The other thing to look at is that you may want to have several small group projects rather than one large group project, because it's much easier to overcome some of the difficulties in a group when it is a short-term goal that you're going for, rather than saying, oh God, this is horrible and I have 6 more weeks of this. And then just as a general thing, it seems like groups of 5 to 8 people really work the best. I definitely push towards 5 over 8, but it seems like these are the size groups where it really allows each member of the group to have a voice and have a role without being so small that if somebody drops out of the class or just isn't hauling their weight, that it really destroys the group as a whole. Just real quick, unfortunately, anytime that we deal with assessments, we will have academic dishonesty issues. Oswego does have a very thorough academic integrity policy, but I would say it's almost too thorough in that it covers a lot of different circumstances. And I really think that you'll have the most luck if you craft your own statement for your course with the academic integrity policy to fall back on. Basically, here's what I allow, here's what I don't allow. And if you do what I don't allow, that's when I go to the academic integrity policy, which will walk me through the process for dealing with that. But I truly hope that you do not run into that very often. It's not fun for anybody. So that pretty much wraps up things. As noted, there's stuff to do in the companion course if you so wish. One particular thing is I've added an assignment with a due date called Breaking the Ice. This is again optional, but I want you to see what the due date looks like from the student view. And if you do decide to submit something for the assignment by the due date, I will grade it and make comments. Obviously, the grades don't matter. It's just like, I'm forgetting the name of the show. Oh, Whose Line Is It Anyway? It's where the points don't matter. So, like I said, if you have the time and want to do that, you'll get the opportunity to see what the feedback looks like for students. So with that, any questions? All right, well, thank you so much for joining me. I fully expect that I'll be back here on Monday, ready to take on actually trying to teach your students something.
Thank you.
I don't seem to be able to turn off the recording. Okay, well, I guess that's that. I will talk to you later, Theresa.